All right. Okay, I think that's finally set up. I'm very happy to be here. I thank the organizers for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk about learning and dynamics in a slightly different context than I think a lot of the work that we've heard about so far, which are dynamics in learning systems that are interacting with people. So in particular, preference and participation dynamics. So the motivation for this work, and I think for maybe a lot of work more broadly, is the existence of these large-scale automated systems which are really important for the functioning of our society, whether that's kind of manufacturing with robotics, whether it's warehousing for shipping goods, or whether it's chemical plants and processes that create a lot of the materials that we use in our goods and services. But there's another form of large-scale automated systems that really pervade our daily lives. These are things like the news feeds on our phones or on our computers, the advertisements and shopping suggestions that we see every time we open up a website, and social media, the way that we connect to others and learn about the world and learn about information. And one thing that sets these types of large-scale systems apart, there are many, but one of them is that, they're really kind of enabled by machine learning and in some ways wouldn't really be possible without it. Well, we've had chemical plants and some forms of robotics and manufacturing and logistics. Lots of these things we can derive models from first principles which are relatively well understood. The same isn't so true for things like people's preferences. What ad is the right one to target to which person? So machine learning is sort of the way that such problems are often framed in this kind of static framework, where training data is used to create a model. A model is something which takes in observations and makes predictions, right? And generally, the way that we train these models or learn them from data is to make sure those observations and predictions kind of match the real labeled data that we have to train with. So, for example, we might have a movie recommendation website which looks at the historical ratings of an individual and then predicts how they're going to like a new movie, right? That's sort of a straightforward prediction task. No matter the domain, the training data and the observation are coming from some environment, some world. And I think this crowd is pretty amenable to the idea that really once you use the prediction for some task, like say recommending which new movie you should go see this weekend, it really becomes part of a policy. And you're really taking an action which will have some impact on that very world. So dynamics arise, right, in this feedback loop for at least two reasons in learning systems like this. One is just from directly the impact of actions on the world. That's kind of classically what we think about in control in physical systems. We think about how we can actuate the physical world. But more broadly, the decisions of machine learning models affect the environment that they're deployed in. There's another form of feedback, and this is actually the one maybe more considered in the machine learning communities, is the way that additional data will then impact the model or impact the policy, right? So there's sort of these two things going on at once. Now, today, I will kind of touch on two different ways that this feedback loop might arise in two different kind of settings, different types of dynamics, and just investigate their implications as sort of a starting point for thinking about how can we take lessons and strategies from designing and controlling safe, large-scale automated systems in the physical world to doing anything at all about the large-scale systems we have in the social world. So first, I'll talk about preference dynamics. This is sort of this inner closed loop that happens between maybe an individual and the content they're consuming from a recommendation algorithm. Then I'll turn to kind of the broader ecosystem of a larger, diverse population interacting with many services that are learning-based, possibly selecting between them in participation dynamics. So to start, preference dynamics, a very simple observation that an individual's interests might be impacted by what they see or read or learn about. A pretty easy example is maybe the first time you hear a genre of music, it takes a little while to catch on, but eventually that's like your new favorite thing and it's all you want to listen to. So here we have a recommendation algorithm or a recommender policy, which chooses content to recommend. If I want to put my controls hat on, I would call this the control input U sub t. Then an individual consumes this content. If I imagine that there's an impact of the content on that individual, I would write down maybe this dynamics model, that there's some internal state which is described, which I'll denote by X, and it updates based on that recommended piece of content. And this internal process is probably not directly observable. It's not something that we have full access to, but generally these large-scale systems do have behavioral traces of what people click on or how people rate things. And so there is some output in the form of expressed preferences, right? And we can call that Y, which I'm going to write this because I think it's important for recommender systems or systems in this area as both a function of the state as well as the input, right? I can't receive, it's unlikely that the system will receive information about advertisements it didn't show to people, right? And this is actually a little bit different from a lot of the physical systems that we think about, and it adds some new challenges. So I want to look at a specific model today and the implications of it. In this model, I will say that actually our outputs are the inner product of the state and the input plus some noise. So this is a bilinear observation model. And it's actually inspired by the machine learning work that goes on to drive recommender systems. This type of inner product model is what underlies factorization-based methods, so like low-rank matrix completion. And in this form, the X kind of represents users' preferences across different attributes, right? So how much do I like movies that are spooky versus romantic versus dramatic? And you can think of U now as a vector representing how much different movies actually have those different attributes, right? Like, is this a scary movie? Is there some romance? And so this is sort of a common modeling assumption in machine learning, and it's the way that I'll model output here. Now, what about the actual dynamics update? There's a lot of things that could go on when you kind of consume a piece of new content. I'll focus on one particular example, the phenomenon called biased assimilation. Biased assimilation is just the idea that you will be most impacted by things that you either really like or really hate. And if you really like something, you kind of like it even more, right? That's kind of assimilation in a biased manner. If you really hate it, you'll hate it even more. And so that is represented by this update where the preference sort of is combined actually with the recommended content with a kind of coefficient that is proportional to that affinity, to that rating, or to that kind of output here. Right. So let's put this together. I'm also going to kind of restrict the preferences and the recommended items to be on the sphere. That way inner products are really just about direction, and I don't have to kind of think about the complexities of magnitude. And just highlight again that this model is really representing a nonlinear phenomenon, right? This is kind of bilinear in X and U, where the update to the preference and the output, the rating that a system might observe, both depend on this affinity, this inner product. So just an example, let's say I'm doing a music recommendation service. This black vector represents this person's preferences. And the recommender system chooses this red, an item that could be represented by this red vector. This is enjoyable. The person likes what they're hearing. And as a result, under this model, their preferences will shift along the circle in the direction of that musical artist. On the other hand, if something totally opposite, actually exactly opposite is recommended, this person hates that. And in the future, they're going to hate it even more, right? Their preferences shift away. And in fact, by symmetry, it actually shifts to the exact same position. So I didn't make this model up. It was proposed in this form by Hasla et al. In 2019 as a model of actually opinion dynamics. And they study this in a non-personalized setting, where you imagine a population of individuals having sort of this diversity of opinions. So that's the gray here, pointing in different directions. And you imagine this non-personalized exposure to pieces of content, right? And even actually in the case of uniformly random exposure generation, what you observe is a polarization phenomenon. So you have that the black line here is where everybody will converge to, either one direction or the other. And now as you recommend new content, this line might shift around a little bit, but the existence of those two poles won't change. So this is a very clear connection between biased assimilation and polarization, right? But I'm curious now about the personalized setting, right? In reality, we don't all consume the same content, and in fact, that's something that's been criticized as maybe even leading more to polarization or filter bubbles or something like this. So can this model tell us anything about that? And should that change the way we think about designing recommender systems? I first want to point out a kind of simple observation. If you kind of choose, so I'm not going to imagine a population of users, but just one, because I'm thinking about personalization. If we choose a fixed recommendation, so one piece of content, and we repeatedly apply it, we get a trajectory that looks like the following, where the preference is always going to be some combination of the initial preference as well as the vector that we continue to recommend, that recommended item. And the coefficient of the initial preference is positive, but decreasing, and it will decrease eventually, not necessarily to 0, but decrease to some fixed value. And another term, which depends on the recommended item, which is increasing in magnitude and either positive or negative depending on the initial reaction, right? So if you really hate something initially, you will essentially converge to the negative of it eventually under this model. And if you love something initially, or you even just like it a little bit, eventually you will really love it and in fact will be completely aligned, right? That is what this model says. So maybe that example kind of makes this obvious, but the goal of recommendation is to show people things that they really like. And so in these dynamics, it's actually pretty trivial to do that, right? So when, especially, even if we don't know somebody's preferences, if we have two different items which are in some sense opposites. So I'll consider the case that we have exact opposites, right? I have U and negative U in my set of movies, right? I have two movies that are kind of opposite in every single way. Then a simple explore then commit algorithm will first, for an exploration horizon logarithmic in the overall horizon, I'll just recommend U, the fixed thing. And I'll observe the reactions. Am I seeing positive or negative ratings? After the horizon is over, I sum up my observations and decide, are they negative or positive? If they are negative, then I was doing bad, I should switch, and I should recommend something that's totally opposite. If they're positive, then all's good, and I'll just keep what I'm doing. Very simple strategy, not a whole lot of learning or identification actually going on, right? And the result that we can say about this algorithm is that as long as this initial U that you've chosen has an inner product bounded away from 0 with the initial preference, right? So it's kind of an informative piece of content. It's not something that you're totally, don't care about. And the noise is sub-Gaussian on the observations. Then the regret, where we compare regret against a very strong baseline, which is the best possible rating. So in this model, since we're on the sphere, users will rate between -1 and 1, right? So 1 is the highest possible rating that your system will see from a user, and the actual rating that you see from the algorithm is, right, this xt ut. So the regret here is bounded by, something logarithmic in t, kind of good bound, a little bit of a classic gap-dependent bandits bound, but a little bit different as well because we have two different terms. We have one, which is the regret of this fixed strategy. So if I know a hemisphere of a user's preferences and I choose any vector in that hemisphere, this is the regret that I will receive. But then there's also this logarithmic term because I might not know the hemisphere ahead of time, right? And so what I want to point out is that because of these dynamics, we don't really have like a d-dimensional preference identification problem. We really have a one-dimensional hemisphere identification problem. And so this turns out to be really easy, a simple algorithm. Sure, we could maybe worry about the gap dependence, and then maybe things would depend on D, but it's not very satisfying, right? Like somehow I don't think that design and recommender systems is actually this easy. So we also look at an alternative goal. This is one motivated by an idea of non-manipulation. So several papers recently thinking about reinforcement learning in the context of humans have proposed the idea that actually like it's bad to manipulate people with computers, and I would agree with that sentiment. And so an alternative goal is maybe to keep preferences stationary. I don't actually want to like shift what people think by what I'm showing them. I want to show them things they like, but also kind of keep them where they were to begin with. And so if I wanted to do this, I could measure my regret instead of looking at ratings, look at the kind of difference between the user's current preferences and where they started out. Now, if I had an item which was precisely the perfect item for this user in my set, there was a movie that was an identical match, I could achieve this goal fairly straightforwardly. That was kind of what we just talked about. But if not, and usually this is not the case, I don't think I've ever found something that was like, that is exactly all of my preferences all at once. Instead, we might want to do some randomization and select the recommendations kind of independently at each time step according to some distribution over items. And in this case, we can show that actually the dynamics update ends up looking like this matrix vector multiply by the preferences. So right here is our old preference, and the update kind of in expectation is this vector multiplication, right? And kind of their informal result here is that if we can design a randomization such that the initial preference is the dominant eigenvector, then, and also our step size decreases in a particular way, then we get logarithmic regret. So this randomization strategy is a good strategy for achieving stationarity. And if you've ever studied kind of a streaming PCA power method type thing, this might be familiar. It actually follows a kind of the same dynamics there. So what does this mean? Like, those are like, you know, two different goals, two different algorithms that kind of achieve those goals. How should we think about these dynamics? Well, we started from the perspective of polarization when we don't care about personalization. And we kind of saw that's not really what happens when you think about personalized recommendations. Instead, we might want to think of some type of mode collapse or preference collapse, where the original kind of richness and diversity then in the preferences that individuals have might collapse towards whatever types of things they just get recommended out of convenience, right? Since we're not actually required to kind of match their preferences directly. But this type of collapse can be avoided, right? It's not kind of inevitable, and it's possible to design algorithms that actually maintain preferences, for example. Now, to actually do this randomization properly, there are some other conditions, but they're relatively straightforward, which is that we need to have that the user's preference is contained in the span of the items that we have to recommend, right? So that's sort of a richness condition on items. And this is true first for actually estimation, right? If we think of this as kind of an output feedback state estimation problem, we need to be able to recommend things that span wherever that initial preference is going to be in order to estimate it. And also, it's necessary for actually designing the randomized recommendation strategy that will achieve stationarity, right? So the conclusion here is sort of if you have enough different types of content to recommend that's proportional to how people's interests look, then we can design strategies that kind of are non-manipulative in some sense. So to kind of sum up the message, in this project, in this type of dynamics, we looked at preferences with biased assimilation. We showed that there's quite different in terms of what you need to do to achieve either high ratings from a user compared with stationary preferences. And we also kind of discussed the difference between personalized and non-personalized settings in terms of some kind of mode collapse compared with polarization. There are some, I think, interesting open technical questions here. One is actually could you do some kind of system identification on some type of biased assimilation inspired dynamics, right? I kind of assumed the form of the model here. The way I assumed it, or the way I wrote it down, there weren't too many parameters to learn, but you could imagine adding in a matrix here and there that might describe some important property that's personal to a user. And when are those actually identifiable from data, right? This is not a linear dynamical system, right? There's this normalization to the sphere, there's this bilinearity in the inputs, and so this is a sort of type of nonlinear system that I think could be interesting to study. And of course, there's a ton of room to incorporate additional phenomena into preferences. I don't actually think that this is how my preferences change. I'm pretty sure if you recommend to me the same song over and over again, I am not going to just love it more and more until I love it perfectly, right? I think there's obviously other factors at play, and that's kind of an open question: boredom, satiation, even inconsistency in preferences. So that kind of brings me to the end of this portion of the talk. I next want to talk about a type of dynamics that I think arises in these systems called participation dynamics. And to motivate this switch, I'll just pose the question: do we really think that social media is mostly manipulating us, changing our preferences, creating radicalization? Or is it really just segmenting and targeting us, finding the people that already think certain things and bringing them together? That's something that has been written about recently in terms of misinformation, disinformation. I think it is an important thing to keep in mind because as a control theorist, I like to think about physical systems, which I'm sure I can change. I don't know that people are the same, right? So maybe I should be a little bit careful trying to apply some of these control-based methods to humans, which I think we all have agency and free will. But in terms of agency and free will, one dynamic that I think is reasonable to model is the idea that people will choose to use a service or participate in something depending on how well it works for them. Is it worth their time? So for example, a music recommendation, if the playlists that are auto-generated by Google Music just don't work for you, maybe you'll switch to Spotify. And this can kind of create a self-reinforcing feedback loop when the learner, in this case, a machine learning-based service, like a music recommendation service, retrains on the data of its current user population, right? You have some population of users who just don't really feel well served. They stop using the service, and consequently, the service has no data from which to kind of correct that. This type of self-reinforcing feedback loop could manifest in this simple example, right? We have two different populations. This is kind of a linear classification task. Each subpopulation, right, each kind of cluster here is linearly separable, but they're not linearly separable together. And so if we have to find a linear classifier, this blue line kind of represents splitting the difference, right? We're approximately equal between the two populations. But maybe we started a little bit favoring the population on the right or left. I'm not sure. The one over here, right? Maybe we favored that one a little bit in the beginning. And so this population on the other side is a little left out, doesn't really feel like the service is working well for them, kind of stopped using it, right? And this dropout effect over time will just amplify the presence of this other population in the training data and make the problem worse. And we eventually end up in this green line where we're doing a really good job for one population and a pretty horrible job for another. So this plot actually comes from a 2018 paper by Hashimoto et al., who kind of coined the term representation disparity to describe this type of fairness concern that happens when you're kind of myopically just trying to learn from data and not really thinking about the composition of your population or how different parts of the population might be served or not. Now, I want to think about this in a multi-learner setting, right? And in reality, we don't just have one service which we either use or never use again. We actually are able to choose between services. At least 5 different websites are on the internet still, as far as I know. And so I'll call the different components of the overall population subpopulations I in 1 through n, and I'll call the learners j in 1 through m. Each subpopulation is kind of selecting in some way or has a participation level in each of the learners, right? So alpha describes the amount, alpha ij describes the amount that subpopulation I is choosing to participate in learner j. So you can think of this as the percent of the subpopulation. So I am kind of imagining distinct groups that make up a population. And the learners, on the other hand, don't really know about the subpopulation structure of the overall population. They're just trying to learn a parameter that performs well, right? They have a deep neural network, or linear regression, and theta describes the parameters in that model. And kind of these two things are going to evolve in a way that's mediated by risks, essentially. So the risk, as in kind of the expected loss over a population, I'll define for each subpopulation I and each learner j, right? So the risk that subpopulation I experiences under the model by learner j. So it's kind of a measure, an inverse measure of accuracy or utility. And I will assume, so okay, it's not actually a deep neural network, it's a 1-layer network because I'm assuming that the risk is strongly convex for ease of analysis. Now, I can write down the dynamics, right? I have some dynamics where the participations update, and then kind of sequentially, the learners update their parameters. We don't need a perfect sequential update, but we do need them to not be simultaneous, right? We can do our model kind of looks at round robin style or random, as long as everybody eventually updates in each subpopulation and learner, and no one does it precisely. Learners and subpopulations don't precisely simultaneously update. The only assumption, the class of dynamics we can consider are fairly simple or fairly generic, which is that each subpopulation favors learners that provide to them lower risk, right? So I'm going to change my allocation in a way that puts higher mass on things that are working well for me, right? And we'll also say that each learner reduces their observed risk. So they don't know about the subpopulation structure, they just see a bunch of data, they update their model such that the risk on that batch of data reduces. And we'll also a slightly stronger assumption also assume that these updates are what I'll call risk minimizing in the limit. If I held everybody else fixed and repeatedly applied one update, I would converge to kind of the partial minimization over that one population or that one learner, right? So these are kind of very multi-agent dynamics. They're myopic, but they are kind of, in some sense, converging to a best response. So for example, let's think of this linear regression task. I have two subpopulations who are circles and squares, and I'll have, let's say, two learners in this case. I'm not sure how well you can see, but basically each subpopulation follows a linear trend, but they follow pretty different linear trends. And so if I initialize the participation to be roughly equal, so I'll show participation of these different data points by their color, ranging from pink to purple, then the learners, 1 and 2, will learn, roughly models that split the difference. But maybe I didn't initialize exactly equally, so I have one learner favoring one population and the other learner favoring the other. You can probably imagine what happens, but over time, that effect will just get stronger from these dynamics. And eventually, we'll kind of have one population really serving subpopulation 1 really well, and one learner serving subpopulation 2 really well. So what do the equilibria look like in general? Maybe I have a lot more subpopulations than I have learners, right? That's fairly standard to imagine that there's only a few different options people can choose between. How will these dynamics, where will they end up? So first, let me define two things. One is the total risk. This is just kind of the average risk over all individuals in a population, right? So on average, how much risk does a random person experience based on the way that they've allocated over models and the models themselves. I'm also going to define a split market. This is kind of intuitive. In this split market, we say the allocation is such that each subpopulation chooses one learner. And subpopulation I, I'm going to say, chooses learner gamma I, right? So there's one thing that they map to. Now, our result is actually just a kind of generic characterization of the equilibria that these dynamics induce. An equilibrium, right, so a fixed point of this update, must have that the parameters are equal to kind of the argmin of the total risk. So the learners each eventually reach the kind of minimum of the populations that they are seeing at equilibrium. But that's not all. It's not asymptotically stable unless, so if and only if, one, we're also at a split market. So we don't have this scenario that a population is splitting the difference between multiple learners. And at the split market, no subpopulation wants to switch, right? There's no other option at the equilibrium that's better, right? So this sort of is intuitive. If there were something to switch to, you would jump to that if possible, right? And then any perturbation in that direction would lead to that new equilibrium, and so this would not be stable. The sketch of this proof is actually a just connection between the total risk as a kind of potential function for the dynamics, meaning that we can characterize the asymptotically stable equilibria as the isolated local minima of the total risk. So that gives us an easy way to sort of connect a pretty broad class of dynamic updates in participation and learning to this one function and what its minima look like. So we also think about the welfare and fairness, implications of these dynamics, right? So what is this, what should we take away from this? The work we were inspired by that thought about just a single learner kind of had the implication that actually doing risk minimization is bad, and we should all do distributionally robust risk minimization to avoid this effect of kind of some populations totally losing out. So for welfare, I'm going to connect this utilitarian notion of welfare kind of inversely to the total risk, right? So on average, people are doing well if the risk is low on average. But I also want to highlight a notion of fairness that's connected to representation disparity, which is a worst case measure. So what is the worst case risk that the worst subpopulation or the unluckiest subpopulation is facing? So we kind of have mixed conclusions. On the positive side, the stable equilibria will be local maxima of the social welfare. So that's not bad. The dynamics will increase social welfare. That seems like a plus. A negative, though, is that actually even the problem of finding the global maximum for social welfare is going to be an NP-hard problem in general. And we actually can see this by connecting this problem to a k-means clustering problem, which is known to be NP-hard. Another downside is that actually utilitarian welfare, this like total risk on average, has nothing to do with the worst case risk, right? You can imagine, you can construct these examples where you have like a really tiny population and a much larger subpopulation, and as a result, the tiny population is always kind of left behind when you look at averages, but the worst case risk could be quite bad. So it's not perfect at solving these problems. But as a positive, the risks will decrease when you add new learners. So the higher the number of learners are, right, the more kind of market competition, although these are not competitive dynamics explicitly, the better off things are in terms of risk. So maybe just to kind of summarize, the key points here are that this kind of myopic form of risk reduction on the part of users and companies based on like participation in learning leads to essentially segregated equilibria. So the market is kind of segmented, but it is at kind of this locally maximum social welfare at least. And I really want to highlight that this is quite different from the conclusions of related work because we consider multiple learners. There are some open questions here. One is finite sample effects. We kind of study expected dynamics, right? Assuming that learners have access to the full distribution of individuals rather than individual data points, and also assuming that subpopulations are choosing continuous valued participation when in reality we might have kind of individuals making stochastic decisions. But this lays the groundwork for the expected dynamics of such stochastic phenomena. Also, what about alternative participation dynamics? What if participations are mediated by recommendation systems, right? That's the whole promise of them, is to help people find things that they like that they wouldn't have otherwise known. Can we imagine recommender systems as somehow solving this clustering problem and helping to do allocation in this way? And also, what about alternative learning dynamics? The related work kind of advocates for a distributionally robust approach to learning models so that your worst case subpopulations have some kind of lower bound. But we didn't analyze this, and it's an open question if that would actually be good or bad in this setting. So that kind of brings me to the end, and I just want to end with kind of a question, which is, why are we studying the dynamics of these systems when I kind of admitted halfway through the talk that I think that they actually are not accurate? I think it's the same reasons that we study dynamics of physical systems as engineers, which are to do things like diagnostics or algorithm design or safety verification. And I think that these are worthwhile goals to have for large automated systems that interact with people socially and psychologically as well. However, I think that actually getting there is going to be difficult. It's not so hard to build a bridge between a technical system and the physical world, right? That's what engineering does and has done for a long time. It's not so easy to see how you would bridge the social and the technical. And in some recent work, I thought about this problem and have proposed with collaborators how you might document something and take qualitative observations and help to translate them into quantitative phenomena, and then go back and forth as you realize the kind of mistakes in your model and which things need to be updated. But I think that's the bigger open question in this area at all, is can we study these dynamics productively? And thank you for your attention. I also want to thank my awesome co-authors, Mihaela, Lillian, Jamie, and Mariam, who were very important in doing this work and giving me ideas.
We have time for some questions.
Hi, thanks for a great talk, thank you. I have a couple of questions. One is the preference dynamics and participation dynamics that you talked about. Can this be extended to things like public policy making, which is kind of adding a control, like via activity-based graph or that kind of stuff, especially with like pandemic and lockdown, what we have seen?
Yeah, I think that is sort of one vision of how to use these dynamical models, is to inform, decisions made on these groups of people, i.e. policy. I would caution against like the direct usage of plugging in the dynamics model to, I forget whatever Stephen Boyd said, and then just running with those U's. I actually think that wouldn't totally be appropriate. I think policymaking does have an important layer of like human decision makers and governance and debate. But I think that these types of models should inform us. Like, what are the things we should be looking out for? What should we argue for in terms of policy, even if we're not going to directly automate that policy?
Thank you. And the second question is, it's more like a social philosophy. It's like for both the preference dynamics and participation dynamics, it's shown that there is this affinity of polarization in participation in split market and in preference dynamics, like things getting polarized in terms of people choosing something. Now, the optimal policy, like optimal recommendation and policy, seems like they try to minimize the risk in terms of some risk function, but that kind of that's kind of polarizing the population. So, is it worth polarizing the population to minimize the risk, which is basically maximizing profit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think anytime you have this idea of like the maximum rating or the maximum something is the ideal thing, you always get these like one-hot policies, right? You want to choose the maximum. That's actually like how you define the problem. And in these cases, that leads to this like self-reinforcing feedback loops, which kind of lead to polarization. I think that I agree that that's probably not the only way the world works, right? Like, I don't think that full segregation and full polarization is like the only natural phenomenon. And there, I would say that we have to think of different objective functions, and those are just usually, they're harder, they're not convex, they're easier, they're more difficult to reason analytically about, but, right, you can imagine like entropy-based functions, like actually what gives high utility is like a high diversity over sort of different topics or something, right? And incorporating those into the models of dynamics or the objectives is how you would see kind of that behavior.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks again for a great keynote. Thank you.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you. Have you thought about incorporating some models from, interventional, processes, psychology, social cognitive models, for instance, used in prediction of things like interventions such as like dieting or exercising. And that could guide, the transition and the dynamics of this process could be applied to your problem as well, rather than just using preferences, right?
Yeah.
Trying to estimate some internal states of a human, motivation or self-confidence and so on and so forth that is typically used in interventional systems.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a lot to be gained from sort of looking at literature in behavioral economics or psychology and figuring out how that would translate into some type of dynamics model, or what are the limits of that, essentially. I think that's a great question, and definitely the two challenges are either models not being fully quantitative, and then you need to decide how to quantify them, how to make them kind of mathematical or symbolic, or things that in like behavioral economics, there's a lot of stuff that is actually quite mathematical, but it's not really a clean dynamics update. It's actually like the solution to an optimization problem, right? Like, people act to maximize their own utilities, and it adds a level of complexity that I think is worth looking into. Like, it's certainly important and much more realistic, I'm sure, but that's kind of the challenge in that space.
Thanks.
I don't want to keep everybody from lunch, so I think.
All right.
Thank you for the questions.
Any last questions? All right, so we'll go to lunch, and we'll resume with the poster session at 1 p.m. Let's thank Sarah again.